The sun had barely risen over the dusty plains, painting the horizon with streaks of pale orange and gold, when Eliza felt the first pangs of dread that would mark the beginning of her new, uncertain life. Her family's farm had been ravaged by disease and drought, leaving her alone and destitute. The once proud homestead, where laughter had filled the air and crops had thrived, now stood in ruins. With no home and no kin to turn to, she wandered the small frontier town, hoping for work, a meal, or a roof over her head. But the world had grown harsher, and her survival depended on chance and the whims of strangers. It was in the market square, a place teeming with the cacophony of merchants and traders hawking their goods, that her fate took its darkest turn. She had been seeking work at one of the trading posts, hoping to barter her modest skills cooking, sewing, and tending to livestock for a few coins. Yet, amidst the throng of people, a man approached her with a friendly smile that failed to reach his cold, calculating eyes. He claimed to have a lucrative opportunity for her, promising shelter and steady wages. Eliza, weary and wary, hesitated. But desperation has a way of clouding judgment, and the warmth of hope pushed her toward his offer. Within hours, that hope was shattered. The man led her to a wagon filled with coarse sacks and cages for animals, but instead of the promised employment, he handed her over to another party, a group of traders whose eyes gleamed with avarice. Silver coins exchanged hands, and the reality struck her like a whip. She had been sold. The weight of betrayal crushed her chest, leaving her breathless and trembling. She tried to protest, but her words fell on ears deafened by greed. The traders paid little attention to her cries, speaking only of profit and the value of property. As the wagon jostled along the rugged path, Eliza's mind raced. Panic and shame warred within her, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly powerless. The rhythmic creak of the wheels and the thud of hooves against the dirt road became a grim accompaniment to her growing fear. She realized with sickening clarity that her future was no longer hers to shape. It had been bargained and sold like the finest silks or the heaviest oxen. Hours passed, and the landscape blurred into a mix of brown and green, the world beyond the wagon doors seeming to slip further from her grasp. The traders spoke among themselves in harsh, guttural tones, oblivious to her presence. She caught fragments of conversation words like Apache and high price that made her stomach twist into knots. Though she had only heard whispers of the Apache from the settlers' tailies, she knew enough to understand the danger. The stories told of fierce warriors, of tribes who had suffered at the hands of encroaching settlers and bore their vengeance like a living fire. To fall into their hands was to court death or worse. Fear, however, was accompanied by a spark of defiance. Eliza pressed her palms against the rough wooden sides of the wagon, feeling the coarse splinters bite her skin. Though trembling, she refused to give in entirely to despair. She was determined to survive, even if it meant relying on cunning rather than strength. Survival, she realized, required understanding her captors, predicting their moves, and seizing any opportunity for escape. Her mind became a silent battlefield, strategizing even as her body shook. As dusk fell, casting long shadows across the plains, the wagon slowed, and the traders spoke of reaching their destination. Eliza's heart pounded. The unknown loomed closer, an invisible hand tightening its grip around her fate. She clutched at the small satchel of belongings she had managed to carry, feeling the last threads of her former life slip through her fingers. The world outside the farm, the town, the life she had known was gone. And yet, in that moment of despair, a quiet resolve took root. She would not simply vanish into history as a mere object of commerce. Somewhere beyond the horizon, in the shadow of fear and hatred, she would find the strength to endure. The first step of her journey had begun not with hope, but with survival, and in that survival lay the faintest promise of agency in a world that had tried to strip it Away. Eliza's eyes fluttered open to darkness pierced by streaks of fading daylight filtering through the woven walls of a tent. Every muscle in her body ached. Her wrists and ankles chafed raw from the coarse ropes that bound her. Panic surged as she realized she was no longer in the wagon, no longer in the familiar, no longer in a world she understood. The air smelled of smoke, earth, and something unfamiliar, tangy and wild. Her heart hammered in her chest, and she struggled against her bonds. But the ropes held firm, cutting cruelly into her skin. For a moment, she could only lie there, wide-eyed, listening. The tent was silent except for the occasional murmur of voices outside. The sounds of movement, soft thuds of boots against the ground, the occasional hiss of a horse told her she was in a place alive with danger. She tried to orient herself, recalling the whispers she had heard in the wagon. Apache. The word returned now with a chill she could not shake. Stories she had been told as a child, tales of fierce warriors and unyielding pride, flooded her mind. She realized with cold certainty that she was at the mercy of someone whose hatred for her kind ran deep. Movement caught her eye, and the entrance of the tent shifted, revealing a figure silhouetted against the last of the evening light. He was tall and imposing, every line of his body a study in controlled power. His dark eyes were sharp, piercing through the shadows as if he could see every thought running through her mind. The warrior's expression was unreadable, but the tension in his stance betrayed suspicion and wariness. He spoke, his voice low and deliberate, a mixture of authority and caution, questioning who she was, where she had come from, and why she was in his territory. Eliza tried to speak, her voice trembling and fragile. Words that might have sounded simple under normal circumstances came out stilted, heavy with fear. Every syllable felt weighted with the possibility of angering him. Yet she knew she had no choice. Silence could be as dangerous as defiance. She chose carefully, emphasizing her helplessness, her unintentional intrusion, trying to appeal to a sense of honor she could only guess at. The warrior's gaze never wavered. He circled her slowly, inspecting her, gauging her reactions. His movements were deliberate, each step measured and precise, like a predator assessing a cornered prey but not yet deciding to strike. Eliza noticed details in his demeanor, the way his hand rested near the weapon at his side, the tight set of his jaw, the flicker of mistrust in his eyes. Despite her fear, she felt a flicker of awe at the sheer intensity of his presence. This was a man shaped by survival and loss, a man whose strength commanded respect even in the face of her terror. As night fell outside the tent, the warrior left briefly, and Eliza was left alone with her fear and the oppressive heat of the small enclosure. She tried to calm her thoughts, focusing on the lessons she had learned about endurance and observation. She examined the tent, noting the structure, the items within, the placement of the fire, and the tools. Every detail could be useful if she had to move quickly, escape, or negotiate for her life. Even in captivity, she reminded herself, survival required vigilance. Hours passed slowly. The sounds outside shifted, distant voices, the crackle of a fire, the occasional snort of a horse, but the warrior did not return immediately. Eliza allowed herself a fleeting, forbidden thought. Perhaps she could live through this. Perhaps she could endure the hatred and fear that surrounded her. But just as quickly, reality returned. The ropes biting her skin, the uncertainty of her fate, and the knowledge that she was utterly at the mercy of a man who despised her people brought her back to a tense, watchful stillness. By the time she heard the flap of the tent signaling his return, Eliza had settled into a careful equilibrium, fear tempered by cautious observation, panic softened by strategy. She was alone in a foreign world, bound by rope and circumstance, facing a warrior whose eyes held the weight of generations of mistrust. The first night in captivity passed with a cruel slowness, leaving her aware of one undeniable truth. Survival here would demand everything she had, and perhaps more than she believed she could give. The morning light filtered weakly through the tent's woven walls, casting long, thin stripes across the dirt floor. Eliza's muscles ached from the cold and the rough ropes that still bound her, but the pressing weight of fear had shifted slightly to determination. She had survived the first night, but she knew that endurance alone would not save her now. The warrior returned, his movements deliberate and commanding. Every step he took seemed to echo the authority he carried, and Eliza's heart pounded with a mix of terror and fascination. He sat across from her, maintaining a careful distance, yet his eyes never left her face. There was a tension in the air, a fragile barrier of mistrust that neither could ignore. "Why are you here?" he demanded, his voice low and steady. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was immense. They carried the authority of a man used to command, and the suspicion of one whose people had suffered greatly at the hands of settlers like her. Eliza's throat was dry. She swallowed hard, choosing her words with care. "I was sold," she admitted, her voice shaking. "I didn't come here willingly. I have no wish to harm you or your people." The warrior's eyes narrowed, and he leaned back slightly, as if weighing her honesty against the instinctual distrust he felt for her kind. He did not relax, but neither did he strike. Instead, he spoke in measured tones, testing her. "Sold? By whom? And why should I believe you are innocent?" Eliza tried to explain the betrayal, the silver coins, the man who had promised her safety but delivered her into danger. Her words tumbled out in a rush, a mixture of fear and urgency. Yet she spoke with the careful clarity she had learned in her long hours of survival. The warrior listened, his expression unreadable, though his sharp gaze betrayed a flicker of contemplation. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Eliza could feel his piercing eyes boring into her, assessing every micro-expression, every subtle shift of posture. The ropes that bound her were no longer just physical. They symbolized the power imbalance, the fragile thread of control that she had yet to challenge. "You lie," he said finally, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Your kind always lies. You come from a world that has taken from mine, and now you stand here, expecting me to trust you?" Eliza's pulse quickened. She could feel the tension coiling like a spring between them. To answer in anger, to defend herself too forcefully, could provoke a violent reaction. But silence, too, could be dangerous, interpreted as defiance or deceit. She chose a careful honesty, bowing her head slightly. "I have no choice but to survive as you do. I did not choose this path, but I will do what I must to live. That is all I ask." The warrior regarded her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he circled the small tent, as if measuring her presence against the space, the ropes, the meager belongings she had managed to bring. There was a tension in his gait, a constant negotiation between instinct and reason. Every glance, every motion, was loaded with unspoken questions. Can she be trusted? Is she dangerous? Could she survive in this harsh land, or is she a liability? Eliza, in turn, studied him. She noticed the precise way he carried himself, the subtle indications of strength honed by years of survival, and the flickers of caution that suggested he was not completely hardened to trust. A thought sparked in her mind, perhaps, despite his hatred. There was a way to navigate this fragile relationship, to gain a foothold through observation and small acts of compliance. For the remainder of the day, their interaction continued in a delicate dance. He tested her knowledge of the land, her ability to understand survival, and her willingness to obey. She answered carefully, showing just enough competence to avoid suspicion, but not enough to appear threatening. Every movement, every word, was a negotiation. Neither offered friendship, but neither struck outright hostility. By nightfall, the initial conflict had established a tenuous balance, captor and captive. suspicion and cautious respect, fear and calculated observation. Both were aware of the unspoken truth. Their fates were now intertwined, and survival depended on understanding not only the harshness of the land, but the human forces that controlled it. The battle of wills had begun, and neither would emerge unscathed. The days that followed were a study in endurance, observation, and the subtle navigation of tension. Eliza quickly realized that her survival depended not only on physical strength, but on understanding the rhythms of the camp and the strict code by which her captor lived. The warrior did not release her from her bonds entirely, but he allowed her limited movement within the tent and around the small fire outside. Each granted freedom was a test, and she learned to move with care, never overstepping boundaries, always mindful of the weight of suspicion in his eyes. Life in the camp was stark and unfamiliar. Eliza watched the Apache men and women as they hunted, cooked, and cared for their young. She marveled at their efficiency, the seamless way each person knew their role, the unspoken communication that bound them together. There was no waste, no hesitation. She had never seen such a connection between people and the land they relied on for survival. And yet, she felt the sting of isolation, the acute awareness that she did not belong, that every movement she made could provoke anger or suspicion. The warrior maintained a watchful presence, often silent, sometimes offering curt instructions. He demanded respect and caution, and Eliza learned quickly that obedience was not subservience, it was survival. She chopped wood when instructed, tended to the fire, and carried water from the nearby stream. Each small act, mundane in the life of the camp, became a negotiation of trust, a subtle assertion that she could be useful without threatening the delicate balance of authority. Over time, small gestures began to shift the dynamic. She learned to anticipate needs. A clean bundle of blankets, a carefully tended fire, a water skin refilled just as it ran low. He did not praise her, but his scrutiny softened in subtle ways, a less sharp word, a glance that lingered slightly longer, the rare nod of acknowledgement. For Eliza, each small sign was a lifeline, proof that she could carve a place for herself, however precarious, yet fear never left her. She was acutely aware that one mistake, one misinterpreted action, could undo all progress. Each meal, each chore, each word spoken was a delicate balance of obedience and careful assertion of competence. The warrior tested her constantly, sometimes in ways that seemed minor, a missed step, a poorly timed gesture, but each test revealed the sharp edge of his distrust and the weight of the hatred he carried toward her people. Despite the tension, Eliza could not help but notice the glimpses of honor and principle beneath his fierce exterior. When a younger member of the tribe struggled with a task, he guided rather than punished. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his words were precise and meaningful, carrying lessons shaped by survival and respect. She realized that the same strictness he applied to her was part of a code he followed for all under his protection. It was a revelation that tempered her fear with cautious curiosity. At night, when the camp settled and the fire's glow cast long shadows across the tent, Eliza would sit quietly, thinking and observing. She memorized the patterns of their lives, the cadence of their routines, and the subtle hierarchy of the camp. She understood that to survive, she needed to become a careful observer, a student of their ways. Even as she remained a prisoner in a foreign world, forced coexistence became both a test and a lesson. She discovered that trust could be earned in small increments, that fear and respect could coexist, and that survival was not merely a matter of physical endurance but of psychological adaptability. The warrior remained distant and wary, but she began to glimpse the possibility of understanding, not friendship, but a tenuous acknowledgement of her presence as more than a burden. By the end of her first week in the camp, the initial terror had evolved into something sharper, something more complex, a delicate, precarious awareness that survival depended on intelligence, patience, and observation. She had not earned freedom, but she had earned a measure of her own agency. And in that realization lay a fragile spark of hope, a spark she would need to nurture if she were to face the days ahead. The days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of the camp began to feel less alien to Eliza, though fear never fully loosened its grip. What had started as raw terror gradually shifted into a careful curiosity, both toward the land around her and toward the warrior who had captured her. She observed him with an intensity born of necessity, noting the subtle details of his behavior, the precision in his movements, the way his eyes followed every gesture, not just of her, but of the camp. At first, communication was limited. Words between them were sharp, practical, and sparse, carrying only essential meaning. Yet over time, a fragile understanding began to emerge. Small acts spoke louder than conversation. She prepared water before he asked, learned to read his expressions and anticipate needs, and crucially, avoided missteps that might provoke anger. He, in turn, began to allow her slightly more freedom, testing her judgment rather than her obedience alone. It was during a hunting trip with a small group from the camp that the first real connection formed. She observed silently at first, then, when an opportunity arose to help, she moved quickly to assist in tending a wounded horse. The warrior's eyes narrowed, wary of interference, but he allowed her to act. Her careful hands, steady despite the pressure, earned a rare nod. No words were spoken, yet a silent acknowledgment passed between them, an understanding that skill and intelligence could earn respect. Even in captivity. As they spent more time together, Eliza began to notice the depth beneath his fierce exterior. He was strict, yes, but there was a code of honor that guided every decision. He protected the young, guided the inexperienced, and respected the natural order of the land and his people. She saw how his hatred toward settlers was tempered by justice and principle rather than sheer cruelty. It was anger rooted in history and loss, not wanton malice. For his part, the warrior seemed to recognize her resourcefulness. He observed how she adapted to the environment, how quickly she learned to identify edible plants, track movement in the shadows, and navigate the unforgiving terrain. Each skill demonstrated a will to survive and an intelligence that could not be ignored. Slowly, the edge of his suspicion dulled, replaced by a grudging respect, a dangerous acknowledgement for someone in her position, yet one that promised a faint bridge across the chasm between fear and trust. Nighttime conversations became more frequent, cautious and laden with unspoken meanings. He would speak briefly of the land, of survival, of the responsibilities he bore to his people. She listened, asking few questions, learning that silence often revealed more than words. In return, she shared fragments of her own story carefully measured, never revealing vulnerability that could be used against her, but enough to hint at her humanity. Slowly, he began to see her as a person shaped by circumstances, rather than merely a representative of the settlers he despised. This growing understanding was not without tension. Moments of fear, misunderstanding, and mistrust punctuated their interactions. A wrong glance, a poorly timed word, or a hesitant action could bring the sharp edge of his anger to bear. Yet these moments became less frequent, and each resolution left a trace of mutual awareness. Both were learning to navigate the delicate balance between power and empathy, suspicion and recognition. By the end of this period, the relationship had shifted. Eliza was no longer merely a captive to be managed. She was a participant in a complex human exchange, where skill, observation, and intelligence could influence outcomes. The warrior's hatred had not disappeared, but it had been nuanced by experience. In their shared silence, their small gestures, and their carefully chosen words, a subtle bond began to form, a bond forged not by friendship, but by survival, respect, and the faint recognition of shared humanity in a world defined by conflict and mistrust. In that fragile understanding lay the potential for something neither had dared to imagine, a connection that could redefine what it meant to endure, to survive, and perhaps even to trust. And for Eliza, that glimmer of possibility was a lifeline, a reason to continue navigating a world that had already taken so much from her. The tranquility of the camp, fragile as it was, shattered one late afternoon. The wind carried a strange, ominous scent across the plains, a mix of smoke and iron that set the warrior's senses on high alert. He moved with a sudden, controlled intensity, alerting everyone to the presence of outsiders. Eliza, sensing the shift in energy, froze. The tension in the camp was immediate and palpable, like a tightly coiled spring ready to snap. Through the sparse trees and the long grass, they saw the encroaching figures, a rival group of settlers and scavengers who had ventured into Apache territory. Their intentions were clear: loot, disrupt, and take advantage of a camp they assumed would be defenseless. For the first time, Eliza saw the warrior's full strength and command in action. Every motion he made was precise, his gaze calculating every threat, every possibility. The calm authority he had displayed in the tent transformed into the fierce efficiency of a leader, defending his people. Eliza's instinct was to hide, but she realized she could not remain passive. The camp had already begun to mobilize, and she could either be a burden or contribute. Using her knowledge of the terrain and quick thinking, she helped position the camp's defenses, guiding the younger members to safer positions and pointing out vantage points where the attackers were most vulnerable. Her hands moved with a purposeful urgency, tying knots, arranging materials, and coordinating small but critical actions. The warrior noticed her initiative. His dark eyes followed her every move, assessing, calculating. A subtle nod acknowledged her efforts, and for the first time, words were unnecessary. The understanding between them had become instinctual. She was no longer merely a captive. She was a participant, a small but vital part of the defense. As the rival group approached, tension erupted into violence. Arrows whistled through the air, and the sounds of shouting, stamping hooves, and clashing wood filled the plains. The warrior fought with controlled fury, every strike deliberate, every decision calculated. Eliza moved alongside the camp, helping where she could, diverting attention, reinforcing weak points, and assisting those injured in the skirmish. Fear surged through her with every passing moment, yet it was tempered by the awareness that her actions mattered. Amid the chaos, the warrior and Eliza found themselves side by side, a rare moment of synchronicity. He covered her when a stray arrow flew close, his hand steadying her as she completed a crucial task. In that instant, there was no captor and captive, only two people relying on skill, instinct, and quick thinking to survive. The shared danger forged a bond that words could never convey, a connection born not of friendship but of mutual necessity and respect. By nightfall, the attackers had retreated, leaving the camp bruised but intact. The warrior surveyed his people and then looked at Eliza. There was no praise, no declaration of trust, yet in the way his gaze lingered, in the subtle shift of his stance, she recognized acknowledgement. She had proven herself not as a member of another race or culture, but as an individual whose courage and intelligence mattered. That night, as the camp tended to the wounded and repaired what had been damaged, Eliza sat quietly, reflecting on the day's events. She realized that danger had a way of stripping away facades and revealing truth. The warrior, despite his enduring mistrust of her people, had come to rely on her judgment and presence. And she, in turn, had discovered a reservoir of courage and resilience she had not known existed. The external threat had tested not only the camp but the fragile connection between captor and captive. It had forced them to act as allies, to bridge the chasm of fear, hatred, and suspicion with necessity and shared survival. And though the danger had passed for now, both understood that the world outside the camp would continue to challenge them, forcing them to navigate a delicate balance of trust, strategy, and humanity. The camp settled into an uneasy calm after the attack, but for Eliza and the warrior, nothing would ever be the same. The events of the day had stripped away illusions, revealing raw truths about themselves and the world around them. In the quiet moments, when the fire crackled and the shadows stretched long across the earth, both reflected on the changes that had begun to take root deep within. For Eliza, the experience of survival had reshaped her entirely. She had entered the camp terrified, bound by ropes and the weight of helplessness, dependent on the whims of a man who despised her. Yet in the weeks since, she had learned the land, observed the patterns of the camp, and, most importantly, tested her own limits. She discovered a resilience she had never known, an ability to adapt, to think quickly, and to act decisively under pressure. Every task she performed, every crisis she navigated, became a testament to her growing agency. She no longer saw herself as a victim. She was a survivor, capable of influencing her fate within the confines of this foreign world. At the same time, Eliza's perception of the warrior began to shift. She had witnessed his strength, his intelligence, and his unwavering code of honor. She realized that his hatred for white settlers was born of pain and history, not indiscriminate cruelty. Beneath his stern exterior, he carried a deep sense of responsibility for his people, tempered by a sharp, disciplined mind. In moments of shared danger, she had seen him rely on her not as a captive, but as an individual whose judgment and courage mattered. This realization did more than instill respect. It sparked a fragile empathy, a recognition that human complexity could exist even in those she had once considered enemies. For the warrior, the transformation was subtler but equally profound. He had captured Eliza with the certainty that she was merely an extension of the settlers who had brought suffering to his people. Yet as days turned into weeks, he observed her careful attention, her willingness to learn, and her resourcefulness. Her courage in the face of the external threat had forced him to confront his assumptions. Slowly, he began to see her as an individual flawed, fearful, but undeniably capable and human. His hatred, once rigid and unyielding, softened into a cautious recognition of her value, not just to the camp's survival, but to the complex moral landscape he navigated daily. Their interactions became less about suspicion and control and more about understanding and mutual recognition. When he spoke, she listened intently, discerning not only words but intent and principle. When she acted, he observed, occasionally allowing her initiative without interference. Each small acknowledgement was a step toward a fragile balance, a recognition that trust, even in a limited form, could exist between them. Eliza's transformation was also emotional. She learned to temper fear with patience, to measure courage against caution, and to find strength in subtlety rather than confrontation. The ropes of captivity had become metaphors for the limitations she now overcame through intelligence and observation. She discovered that power did not always lie in strength of arms. Sometimes it lay in understanding, in adaptability, and in quiet resilience. The warrior, too, underwent a subtle internal shift. He recognized that survival required not only physical prowess but the ability to judge character beyond prejudice. The external threat had revealed that alliances could form in the most unlikely circumstances, and that respect, earned through action and integrity, could challenge even ingrained hatred. By the end of this period, both were irrevocably changed. Eliza no longer saw herself solely as a captive, and the warrior no longer saw her solely as an enemy. They had begun to navigate a world defined not just by fear and suspicion, but by the complexities of human behavior, the possibility of understanding, and the quiet strength that comes from shared experience. In this inner transformation, the seeds of a deeper connection were planted, not romance nor friendship in the conventional sense, but a recognition of humanity that transcended fear, hatred, and circumstance. Both had learned that survival was as much about the mind and heart as the body, and that the capacity for understanding could exist even in the harshest of environments. First light of dawn spilled over the plains, painting the camp in soft hues of gold and amber. The night had been calm, the only sounds the rustle of leaves and the occasional murmur of the warriors preparing for the day. For Eliza, the morning carried a weight unlike any she had known before, a quiet reflection on the journey that had brought her here, bound first by ropes and fear, now tethered by understanding and a fragile sense of agency. The warrior observed her from a distance, his posture relaxed yet watchful. There was no need for harsh commands. Trust had begun to take root in small, cautious ways. He had witnessed her courage, her intelligence, and her ability to endure in the harshest of circumstances. In turn, she had seen the depth of his honor, the principles that guided his actions, and the pain that had forged his mistrust of her people. They no longer occupied the rigid roles of captor and captive. They had begun to exist in a nuanced space between fear and respect, suspicion and acknowledgement. Eliza moved carefully through the camp, tending to her small responsibilities and observing the rhythms of daily life. She knew that her freedom, still limited, was now defined by her choices, her intelligence, and her ability to navigate the delicate balance of power. The warrior approached her silently, stopping just short of the space she had claimed near the fire. For a moment, their eyes met not with hostility, nor with formal authority, but with a quiet understanding. The world outside the camp remained a threat, as it always had. Settlers and rival tribes still posed dangers, and the harshness of the land demanded vigilance and strength. Yet within the confines of this community, Eliza had carved a place for herself. She had survived the ropes, the fear, and the hatred, and in doing so had discovered a capacity for endurance and resilience she had never known. The warrior nodded to her, a subtle gesture loaded with meaning. There were no words of praise, but in that simple movement lay acknowledgment. She was more than a prisoner, more than a symbol of the people he despised. She was a participant in this fragile world, capable of contributing, learning, and surviving. In that moment, Eliza felt the faintest spark of something she had not dared to hope for, a recognition. That survival was not merely about endurance, but about connection, understanding, and the ability to navigate human complexity. As the day unfolded, both returned to their respective roles within the camp, yet something fundamental had shifted. Fear no longer dominated her thoughts. Suspicion no longer dictated his actions. Their relationship, tentative and fragile, had evolved into a form of coexistence founded on respect, intelligence, and the acknowledgement of shared humanity. Each understood that the past could not be undone, that history had left its mark, but that the present offered a chance to redefine the terms of survival. By nightfall, as the fire crackled and shadows danced across the tents, Eliza sat quietly, reflecting on the journey she had endured. She was no longer simply a captive. She was an active participant in her fate, a woman who had survived betrayal, fear, and prejudice. The warrior, too, had been changed not by love or friendship, but by the recognition that human strength and courage could transcend the barriers of hatred and history. The resolution was subtle, not triumphant in the conventional sense, but deeply significant. Survival had been achieved, understanding had been forged, and a fragile peace had emerged, not just between two people, but within the landscape of fear, history, and cultural tension that had defined their lives. In the quiet moments before sleep, both could feel it, a world where fear and hatred no longer dictated every action, where respect and recognition could coexist with the ever-present demands of survival. And in that quiet, fragile space, Eliza realized something profound. Even in captivity, even in the shadow of hatred and history, it was possible to reclaim agency, to understand another human being, and to endure not as a victim, but as a survivor.